Okay, so we have moved past the first page. Yay! There's that first page is just so rich with meaning, and I really just don't want you to miss it. But looking on to the next page, um, so we see that, they're supposed to just live this normal kind of a life. Um, and we get a little bit of information about the Potters, at least from the Dursleys' perspective. So on page 2, um, we find out that there is some tension here between Mrs. Dursley and Mrs. Potter. So they're sisters. Okay, so keeping this in mind. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too, but they had never seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. So this is a theme that we will be discussing, but there's a lot of social discussion of social class here, and so this is a really good example of that. Now, the first question that you should be asking yourself is why does Mrs. Dursley reject her sister so intensely? And that's a question that you'll be able to answer as you keep reading, unless you've already read ahead and read this before, and then you know the answer to that. But nonetheless, when Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. So we learn that the story really begins here on Tuesday. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. Okay, so first of all, this is daytime, and even though the sky is cloudy, we still know that that owls are nocturnal, but we see an owl flutter past the window in the morning. It says at 8:30, right after that, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase after picking out his most boring tie for work, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and then tried to kiss Dudley goodbye. So we know that something is amiss. That's the first clue that something is abnormal, but they don't seem to notice. The second clue that we get on page 2 is a cat reading a map. Okay, so before we get to the cat reading the map, let's talk about the symbol of the owl. The owl is a symbol because it represents a multitude of things. Wisdom, for one, as you know from when we looked at, you did your Snow White fairy tale analysis. Perfect wisdom, mystical wisdom, even ancient knowledge of the powers of man, right? There's this idea that owls are able to do some things that we are not able to do. It's those big knowing eyes that they have, and the fact that they are awake when we are asleep is that they know something that we do not know. Now, the next abnormal thing that we see is a cat reading a map on a dull gray Tuesday, right? As if nothing exciting is going on, and yet there's a cat reading a map. And so then that calls into question the symbol of cats being used here. What you're probably hearing in the background is me turning the pages of my book to go to the next page. And so in ancient Egypt, cats were considered the guardians against evil and disease. In Japan, they're thought to bring a positive change in fortunes. So all of this is foreshadowing why she has made Professor McGonagall appear to us first as a cat. In ancient Greece, cats are associated with darkness, the underworld, witchcraft. We know that both of these characters, Dumbledore and McGonagall, who show up on Harry's, the Dursleys' doorstep, which will be soon Harry's doorstep, we know that they are associated with the witchcraft world, right? McGonagall is a witch and Dumbledore is a wizard. And then in Christianity, even, we associate them with evil and witchcraft, but in this case, we know that these are good characters, right? They are good characters who are trying to do the right thing and trying to protect Harry. So it's a really powerful symbol to use is a cat. And how perfect, right? Because you always see a witch with like a black cat, for instance. And so that just conjures up just the right amount of suspicion and magic all at the same time. And then finally, we get some action here, some real action. It's about midnight. So what they've been doing is just observing the Dursleys' house and their household, the members who live there, this whole time. And so midnight is when action takes place, of course, under the cover of darkness. Midnight is the perfect time for a witch or a wizard to do anything. And so at nearly midnight, we catch a glimpse of Albus Dumbledore, and this is how he's described. He's wearing long robes, a purple cloak, half-moon spectacles, and a very long, crooked nose. And I included a picture of him here from the movie because this is how we probably all picture Dumbledore now, having seen the movie or been somewhat familiar with the film. And it's a great depiction of him. And remember that purple connotes wealth, royalty, status, right? And so he's been in disguise all this time, and now he's taking his true form. The cover of darkness was a protective measure for all of them, Harry Potter included. So then, after that, we see McGonagall for who she is. She's no longer the cat, which Dumbledore says, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly. And I think this is a great picture to kind of depict her temperament. We see her severe looking, square glasses, arrived in the form of a cat. So all those connotations that come with that. And she wears a long emerald cloak instead of long purple robes. And so her long emerald cloak means something. And I told you before, we're going to see green time and time again. And so there is a significance with that color. If that's something that you're interested in writing about, you are welcome to do so. Even her hair is in a tight bun. So all of this characterizes these two characters, tells us a little bit about who they are, what their status is. And then shortly thereafter, we learn why they are there. Dumbledore says, this is the house. This is where we're going to leave Harry. And McGonagall says, you can't mean the people who live here? Cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at the number 4. So again, we see 4 on the very first page, but it's a small detail that most readers probably would have forgotten by now. So we get up the point of actually having it be pointed out to us yet again, pointing at the number 4, which is just phenomenal. Now here's why I love the book a little more than the movie, because we don't get that kind of detail in the movie, but there's a really important reason for why this is being drawn to our attention yet again. And then we get our first glimpse of Harry. Just visible was a baby boy fast asleep. Under a tuft of jet black hair, over his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut, like a bolt of lightning. So we get yet another symbol here. Dumbledore says, yes, he'll have that scar forever. Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore? Professor McGonagall asked. Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in handy. I have one myself above my left knee that is a perfect map of the London Underground. And so we get to understand that Harry's scar is significant. It's so significant, in fact, it's so important, in fact, that Dumbledore refuses to remove it because he thinks, he considers it of significant value. And so the scar is a symbol of Harry's strength, Harry's survival from when Voldemort tried to kill him. And as we know from any good hero or hero's journey, we know that a hero is marked for his greatness like a rite of passage. This connotes that Harry is the chosen one. And I love this idea of a scar being right on his face because it's this visual defiance of the powers that be, which at that time was Voldemort, because remember at the time Voldemort and his people had taken over. Now you don't know that from reading chapter 1, but I'm telling you that to help to put the significance of the scar into perspective. And so then we end chapter 1 with a breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the sky. This is on page 17, the very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Now, I love the fact that that's written down there because it bodes really well for the ones reading this book, because it tells us that we too can be a part of this magical world that will unfold before us no matter how normal or how regular we are. Just like Harry, we too can be chosen for greatness and have been chosen for greatness if we keep reading. And that's chapter 1.